They lied. NASCAR knew it. Chrysler knew it. But America, not a clue. In 1964, Chrysler unveiled an engine so powerful that it sent shockwaves through the racing world. A V8 so dominant that Ford and GM wanted it erased from history. But instead of killing it, NASCAR's ban only made it more legendary. What was Chrysler hiding? Why was this engine too dangerous for the track? And how did a secret loophole bring it back from the dead? This is the shocking true story of the banned 426 HEMI. The engine that changed racing forever. The birth of a monster. To understand why the 426 HEMI was banned, you need to understand why it was created in the first place. The early 1960s were a war zone for American auto manufacturers. NASCAR wasn't just a racing series, it was a battlefield. Ford, Chevrolet, and Chrysler were locked in a never-ending arms race for horsepower supremacy. The idea was simple: build the fastest engine, win races, sell more cars. At the time, Ford's 427 FE engine was dominating the NASCAR scene. Chevrolet had the 409 W-head engine, which was fast but starting to show its limits. And Chrysler? Well, Chrysler was playing catch-up with their 413 Max Wedge. It was good, but not good enough. Chrysler needed a weapon, something that would annihilate the competition. Inside Chrysler's engineering department, something sinister was brewing. A top-secret project was underway, led by Tom Hoover and the legendary Ramchargers. Their mission? To build an engine so powerful that it would force NASCAR to rewrite the rulebook. And that's exactly what they did. The science behind the beast: enter the hemispherical combustion chamber. Now, Chrysler had experimented with HEMI engines before. Back in the 1950s, they had the 331, 354, and 392 HEMI 5.8s, which were already proving their worth in drag racing and land speed records. But this was different. This was bigger, badder, and more brutal. So what made it so special? Hemispherical cylinder heads instead of the traditional wedge-shaped chambers. The HEMI used a dome-shaped design that allowed for larger valves and better airflow. More air meant more power. Bigger valves equals more combustion. The intake and exhaust valves were massive, giving the engine unmatched breathing capability. Extreme durability. Chrysler overbuilt the 426 HEMI, reinforcing the block and crankshaft so that nothing could break it. The result? A 7.0-liter, 426 cubic inch monster that pushed over 500 horsepower straight out of the gate. That was unheard of in the early 60s, but Chrysler wasn't just about building a fast engine. They were about to make history. The 1964 Daytona 500, Chrysler breaks NASCAR. February 23, 1964. Daytona International Speedway.
Taking over the lead there on the inside in that 64 Plymouth.
The world was about to witness something they had never seen before. Chrysler unleashed the beast. The 426 HEMI made its NASCAR debut. And it wasn't just fast, it was unstoppable. The first victim? Ford. Ford's 427 FE engine had been ruling NASCAR, but the moment the HEMI hit the track, the game changed. Richard Petty dominated the Daytona 500, finishing a full lap ahead of second place.
Richard Petty is pouring it on.
Out of the top 5 finishers, 4 were driving HEMI-powered Plymouths. Petty's 1964 Plymouth Belvedere was clocking speeds NASCAR had never seen before. This wasn't just a victory, this was a massacre. Ford and GM weren't just losing, they were being humiliated. And that's something they weren't going to stand for. The outrage, Ford and GM call for a ban. After Daytona, the complaints started rolling in. Ford and GM couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. How the hell was this legal? The 426 HEMI was so dominant that it made the competition irrelevant. NASCAR was supposed to be about tight, competitive racing, but with the HEMI on the track, it was just Chrysler versus Chrysler, and that's when the lobbying started. Ford and GM went straight to NASCAR, claiming that the HEMI was too advanced, too powerful, and too unfair. At first, NASCAR officials weren't sure what to do. On one hand, Chrysler had followed the rules. The 426 HEMI was a legally built engine with nothing technically illegal about it. But on the other hand, NASCAR couldn't afford to let one manufacturer run away with the entire sport. Ford and GM made their argument simple. If Chrysler is allowed to keep this engine, we're pulling out of NASCAR. And just like that, NASCAR had no choice. But the ban hammer falls. By the end of 1964, NASCAR officially banned the 426 HEMI. They announced a new rule stating that engines must be available in production cars before being eligible for NASCAR. This was a clear attack on Chrysler. They weren't banning the engine because it was illegal. They were banning it because it was too good. Chrysler had two choices: give up and go home. Find a way around the ban. And let's be honest, Chrysler doesn't back down. They weren't going to let Ford and GM bully them out of the sport. They had a plan to take this banned racing engine and turn it into one of the most feared street engines of all time. What happened next changed the muscle car world forever. NASCAR thought they had buried the 426 HEMI for good. By banning it in late 1964, they believed they had leveled the playing field, protecting Ford and GM from complete annihilation. But Chrysler wasn't about to let their most powerful weapon disappear. The HEMI wasn't just another V8. It was an engineering masterpiece, a racing juggernaut that had already proved its dominance. And if they couldn't use it on the track, they would take the fight to the streets. This is how Chrysler turned a banned race engine into the most feared power plant of the muscle car era. The loophole that saved the HEMI. NASCAR's new rule was clear. If an engine wasn't available in a production car, it couldn't race. Ford and GM had pressured NASCAR into making the HEMI illegal by arguing that it wasn't a real production engine, it was just a specialized race motor, unavailable to the public. So Chrysler did the only logical thing. They put it in a production car. Not just any car, though. They created a street-legal monster, a machine so ridiculous that it redefined what a muscle car could be. In 1966, Chrysler released the 426 Street HEMI. This wasn't a detuned version of the race engine. It wasn't a watered-down attempt at performance. It was the real deal. A 426 cubic inch beast with dual 4-barrel carburetors, 10.25 to 1 compression, massive valves, and a solid bottom end that could handle unlimited abuse. It was basically a race car engine dropped into street-legal Plymouths and Dodges, and it scared the hell out of everyone. The birth of the street HEMI, 1966 to 1971. Chrysler introduced the 426 Street HEMI in the 1966 Dodge Coronet and the Plymouth Belvedere. At a glance, they looked like ordinary muscle cars, but under the hood, they were hiding a race-ready engine built to humiliate anything on the road. Officially, Chrysler rated the engine at 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, but anyone who actually drove one knew the truth. These cars were putting out closer to 500-plus real horsepower, making them some of the fastest factory muscle cars in history. The Dodge Charger soon joined the lineup, packing the HEMI under its long, sleek body. The Plymouth GTX and Roadrunner followed, offering HEMI power for street racers who wanted to dominate drag strips. Then came the Dodge Super Bee, a bare-bones muscle car designed to stuff as much power into as little weight as possible. If you saw a HEMI badge on the fender of one of these cars, you knew you were about to get smoked. But Chrysler wasn't just interested in selling street cars. They had unfinished business with NASCAR, and in 1966, they got their revenge. The HEMI returns to NASCAR. By 1966, Chrysler had met NASCAR's demands. The 426 HEMI was now a production engine, legally available to the public. NASCAR had no choice but to lift the ban, and the second the HEMI was allowed back on the track, it picked up right where it left off, by dominating. In 1966, David Pearson won the NASCAR championship in a HEMI-powered Dodge Charger. In 1967, Richard Petty crushed the competition, winning 27 out of 48 races, including a record-breaking 10 races in a row. Ford and GM were furious. They had fought so hard to get the HEMI banned, and now it was back, destroying everything in its path. And Chrysler wasn't stopping there. They were about to create something even more insane, something so fast, so terrifying, that it would push NASCAR to rewrite the rulebook all over again. The Winged Warriors, Super Aero HEMI cars, the 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona, and the 1970 Plymouth Superbird weren't just muscle cars, they were weapons. Built specifically to dominate NASCAR, these cars were designed entirely around aerodynamics. Massive nose cones sliced through the air. Towering rear wings kept them glued to the track at high speeds. And under the hood, the 426 HEMI was still king. The results were immediate. In 1970, the Plymouth Superbird became the first NASCAR stock car to break 200 miles per hour. Buddy Baker shattered speed records at Talladega, proving that the HEMI-powered aero cars were untouchable. Ford and GM were losing again. And just like before, they went crying to NASCAR. After watching Chrysler's aero cars rewrite the laws of speed, NASCAR officials made a decision. They banned them. This time, they didn't just target the engine. They outlawed the entire concept of winged cars, forcing Chrysler to retire its most extreme racing machines. The 426 HEMI had been banned for the second time. But it didn't matter, because by then the HEMI had already cemented its place in history. The street HEMI continued terrorizing drag strips well into the 70s, becoming one of the most legendary muscle car engines of all time. Today, if you see a real 426 HEMI-powered Charger, Cuda, or Roadrunner, you're looking at one of the most valuable and feared muscle cars ever built. Even after multiple bans, the legend of the 426 HEMI refuses to die. By the early 1970s, the 426 HEMI had done the impossible. It had been banned twice from NASCAR. It had dominated the muscle car scene. It had become a legend both on the track and on the streets. But while the HEMI seemed unstoppable, dark clouds were forming on the horizon. New regulations, rising insurance costs, and government intervention were about to do what Ford, GM, and even NASCAR couldn't: kill the HEMI for good. This is the final battle of the 426 HEMI, and how one of the most powerful engines in history was forced into extinction. The government declares war on muscle cars. By 1971, muscle cars had become a serious problem, at least according to politicians, insurance companies, and safety advocates. For years, Detroit had been competing for raw horsepower, with automakers pushing bigger engines, higher compression ratios, and insane top speeds. And the HEMI? It was public enemy number one. Insurance companies started raising premium rates for high-performance cars, especially those with 426 HEMI badges. If you were a young driver trying to insure a HEMI-powered Charger or Cuda, you were looking at rates higher than your car payment. Then, the U.S. government got involved. In 1970, the Clean Air Act was passed, setting strict emissions regulations that choke the life out of high-performance engines. In 1971, New fuel economy laws started creeping in, putting a target on the backs of big displacement V8s. And to make things worse, leaded fuel, which high-compression engines needed, was being phased out. Detroit's muscle car war was coming to a screeching halt, and Chrysler saw the writing on the wall. The 1971 HEMI cars, the last of the breed. Chrysler fought to keep the HEMI alive, but the government and insurance industry were making it impossible. By 1971, the writing was on the wall. The 426 HEMI was expensive to build, expensive to maintain, and now expensive to own. That year, Chrysler produced its final batch of HEMI-powered street cars. And they weren't just any cars. They were some of the rarest and most sought-after muscle machines ever built. The 1971 Plymouth HEMI Cuda convertible. Only 11 units were built, making it one of the most valuable muscle cars on Earth. Today, these cars sell for millions of dollars at auction. The 1971 Dodge Charger RT HEMI, a street-legal brute that was one of the last HEMI-powered Mopars ever made. The 1971 Dodge Challenger HEMI, a final hurrah before the muscle car era began to fade. These weren't just cars, they were the last survivors of a dying breed. Because after 1971, Chrysler made it official. The 426 Street HEMI was dead. It had survived NASCAR bans. It had survived Ford and GM's attacks, but it couldn't survive the government. The HEMI's last stand, drag racing dominance. Just because the HEMI was dead on the street didn't mean it was dead on the track. While NASCAR had regulated the HEMI out of existence, drag racing was a different story. Throughout the 1970s, the 426 HEMI became the undisputed king of the quarter mile. Chrysler knew that their factory street cars were finished, so they started selling HEMI crate engines to professional drag racers. And these weren't just any engines. The 426 HEMI was being modified, supercharged, and tuned beyond recognition, turning it into the ultimate drag strip weapon. Top fuel dragsters and funny cars started using supercharged 426 HEMIs, pushing out over 5,000 horsepower. Don Big Daddy Garlitz and other legendary racers broke speed records using HEMI-powered dragsters. The HEMI Dart and HEMI Barracuda became famous factory drag racers, built specifically to dominate the NHRA. Even after its death in production cars, the 426 HEMI was still too powerful to kill. But by the late 1970s, even drag racing was beginning to change. Technology was evolving, turbochargers and fuel injection were replacing raw displacement, and the golden era of big block monsters was fading. The HEMI had made its mark, but its time was finally up. The resurrection of a legend. For decades, the 426 HEMI remained a mythical engine, spoken about in whispers by gearheads and collectors. Prices of original HEMI cars skyrocketed. If you wanted a real 426 HEMI car, you were either a millionaire or extremely lucky to find one rusting away in a barn. But then, something unexpected happened. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Dodge and Chrysler were ready for a comeback. Muscle cars were returning. The retro era was in full swing, and Chrysler had one final trick up its sleeve. In 2003, the HEMI name returned. It wasn't the same 426 monster from the 60s and 70s, but it was a modern reimagining. A 345 cubic inch, 5.7-liter HEMI 5.8, designed for a new generation of Mopar fans. This new HEMI wasn't a race-bred terror like its ancestor, but it revived the legend. Soon, Dodge started putting HEMI badges on Chargers, Challengers, and even Ram trucks. And in 2015, they unleashed the Hellcat. a supercharged 6.2-liter HEMI with 707 horsepower, built to terrorize the streets just like the original. And if that wasn't enough, Dodge introduced the Demon, our 840 horsepower drag strip monster, proving that the spirit of the 426 HEMI was alive and well. The HEMI never really died. The 426 HEMI is one of the most legendary engines in history. Even though the original was banned, even though it was killed off in 1971, its legacy is stronger than ever. If you see a 426 HEMI-powered Cuda, Charger, or Roadrunner, you're looking at a piece of American history. The engine that forced NASCAR to change the rulebook twice. The engine that made Ford and GM sweat. The engine that dominated the streets, the track, and the drag strip. The engine that, no matter how many times they tried to kill it, just wouldn't die. By the time the 426 HEMI was officially retired from production in 1971, it had already become one of the most feared and respected engines in American history. It had been banned from NASCAR for being too dominant, pushed out of production by rising insurance rates, and finally crushed by government regulations. But despite every attempt to bury it, the HEMI refused to be forgotten. For decades, it lived on in drag racing, in the garages of die-hard Mopar enthusiasts, and in the minds of muscle car lovers who had witnessed its brutal power firsthand. Even as emissions laws strangled high-performance V8s and fuel economy regulations forced automakers to build weaker, more efficient engines, the legend of the HEMI only grew stronger. At first, most people didn't realize just how rare and valuable HEMI-powered muscle cars would become. Many of them were raced, wrecked, or simply left to rust. Nobody in 1975 thought a 426 HEMI Cuda or Charger would one day sell for millions. Back then, it was just another gas guzzler from a dead era. But as time passed, something unexpected happened. The HEMI became a collector's dream. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, classic muscle cars started skyrocketing in value, and none were more sought after than the legendary 426 HEMI-powered Mopars. The few surviving examples became holy grails in the automotive world. What had once been just another high-performance option was now an untouchable piece of American history. By the early 2000s, original HEMI cars had reached astronomical prices. A 1971 Plymouth Cuda convertible with a factory 426 HEMI, one of just 11 ever built, sold for an unbelievable $3.5 million at auction. Even standard HEMI Chargers, Roadrunners, and Super Bs were commanding six-figure price tags. What was once banned, scrapped, and left for dead had become the most valuable muscle car engine ever built. But for Mopar fans, the legacy of the HEMI wasn't just about high-dollar collector cars. It was about what that engine stood for: raw, unfiltered, unapologetic power. And after being absent for decades, Dodge was about to bring that power back in a way no one expected. For nearly 30 years, Mopar fans had been dreaming of the HEMI's return. Then, in 2003, Dodge finally made it happen. The new HEMI wasn't a 426, but it was a modern evolution of the same legendary concept. With a hemispherical combustion chamber, big power, and a rumbling exhaust note, the 5.7-liter HEMI V8 brought muscle back to Dodge's lineup. At first, it was a truck engine, introduced in the Dodge Ram 1500. But it wasn't long before Dodge started dropping HEMIs into their performance cars, starting with the Charger, Magnum, and Chrysler 300C. But Dodge didn't stop there. Soon, they introduced bigger and badder versions of the engine, bringing the 6.1-liter and 6.4-liter HEMI into their high-performance SRT models. Mopar was back, and just when it seemed like Dodge had reached the peak of muscle car insanity, they went even further. In 2015, Dodge changed the game forever. They unveiled something so extreme, so powerful, that it made even the original 426 HEMI look tame. The Hellcat, a 6.2-liter supercharged HEMI with 707 horsepower. This wasn't just a fast car, it was a street-legal rocket. It could go 0 to 60 in 3.6 seconds and run the quarter mile in under 11 seconds, straight from the factory. Nothing else on the road could touch it. The Hellcat Challenger and Charger instantly became modern muscle car legends. But Dodge wasn't done. In 2018, they took things to an even more insane level with the Dodge Demon, an 840 horsepower drag racing monster that was so fast, so extreme, that the NHRA banned it from competition. Sound familiar? It was history repeating itself. Just like the 426 HEMI had been too dominant for NASCAR, the Demon was too fast for the modern drag strip. Dodge had brought back the spirit of the original HEMI, and once again it was making the competition look weak. But even with all this success, the writing was on the wall. The world was changing, and the era of big gas-powered V8s was coming to an end. Dodge has confirmed that the gas-powered HEMI will soon be phased out. The 2023 Charger and Challenger are the last of their kind. After that, Dodge is moving toward electric muscle cars, starting with the upcoming Charger Daytona EV. For many Mopar fans, it feels like the end of an era, and maybe it is. But if history has taught us anything, it's this: the HEMI never truly dies. They tried to ban it in NASCAR. They tried to kill it with regulations. They tried to bury it in history. And every single time it came back. It came back in drag racing. It came back in collectors' garages. It came back in the 2000s. It came back as the Hellcat. And who's to say it won't come back again? The 426 HEMI is more than just an engine. It's a legend. And as long as people love raw power, speed, and muscle cars, that legend will live on. And if you thought the banned 426 HEMI was an insane story, wait until you hear what happened to GM's banned 454 LS7 Big Block. That's a whole different level of controversy.